So hi everyone, and welcome to the last EJN webinar of 2020. This is the sixth and final webinar in series 2, and what a year it's been. My name is Kenneth, Killeen. I am the director of Improvised Music Company, a resource organisation and promoter of jazz in Ireland, and also artistic director of the 12 Points Festival, which is a pan-European showcase festival of emerging innovative talent. So our title for today is You've Changed, a reference to the Carl Fischer Jazz Standard, as with all of the other titles in the series. And You've Changed, I mean, that may be one of the most singular understatements of the year when it comes to live music festivals and events, because this year we have all changed. We've all had to change and adapt. We've had to innovate and overcome. We've had to reevaluate a lot and generally coax new things into existence to keep our decimated live music industry somewhat afloat. So today's theme is about that. It's about change. And specifically the digital pivot this year, which has led to the emergence of hybridization, all of these new terms, hybrid festivals and events that are part online, sometimes pre-recorded, and of course, wherever possible, partially live. But now that we've made this switch and let's say embraced digital technology as we never have before, or were coerced into using this technology because we had no other options available to us, what are the models that have worked well? And what is the future for this hybrid form in a sector where experiencing live music is absolutely paramount? For those of you watching at the end of December 2020, we are on the cusp of both a virulent third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the rollout of vaccines across the world. So we are, as we have been since March, living in hope and fear. It's clear, despite the new horizon of vaccines and the promise which they hold, that this process of hybridization will be with us well into 2021. But more importantly, this pandemic, through necessity, has introduced new paradigms in the presentation of live music that may well be with us for a lot longer. For those of you watching the live stream, feel free to join in on the discussion and ask a question or comment, and we'll put it to our panelists if we have the time. So joining me today are 4 very special guests, people with first-hand experience of the marked changes and adaptations we have had to make collectively as an industry this year, and they are in no particular order. Joining us from London, Pelin Opcin. She is the Director of Programming and a board member at Sirius. She's also leads on strategy and programming for the EFG London Jazz Festival. Welcome, Pelin. From New York, esteemed American jazz pianist, composer, educator, and artistic director for jazz at the Kennedy Center, Mr. Jason Moran. I'm Irish, so I'm very tempted to say Jason Moran, but we all know this is Jason Moran. Welcome, Jason. From a small city near Jerusalem, the executive director of the International Music Showcase Festival in Israel, and also director of the renowned Yellow Submarine venue, Mr. Atcha. Welcome, Atcha. And finally, from Berlin, artistic director of the Jazzfest Berlin and improvisatory polymath, Miss Nadin Deventer. Welcome, Nadin. So while talking about change, I suppose there are 3 important facets or perspectives to be aware of. The perspective and input of the artist, the perspective of organizations, and of course, thirdly, and most importantly, to some degree, let's not forget the perspective and input of audiences as we move through these new paradigms. I want each of today's guests to reflect on their experiences, and we'll do that individually with each of them before we open it up in the latter part of this discussion to a more roundtable discussion on what all of this means for the future. Jason, I'll come to you for an artist perspective shortly, but I would like to start with Pelin, because Pelin, you, I mean, along with Nadin, along with all of you basically, have had to make difficult choices this year and change the outputs that you normally do to create entirely new models, be they hybrid or online in particular. So Pelin, I'll go to you first. If you could just give me your perspective of this year in terms of the changes that you've made, what that has meant, what you might have learned from that, and then we can get a little bit deeper into it later on.
All right, thank you. Such a great introduction. I think festivals, organizations like festivals, especially you are undertaking a big commitment saying that you are the London Jazz Festival. You are doing this for more than 30 years and under the festival umbrella, 28 years. I think there's a big responsibility. So with this responsibility, it's not just self-actualization of, what the festival stands for. It's the collective, responsibility or sort of contributing to the optimism of the scene. You have to do something. So we were definitely hit by the first shock, and we were thinking about logistic, solutions on how we can approach the issue. But at the end of the day, the core in our decision making was this belief that the festival cannot stop whatever happens. And we were aware, we were used to the digital tools. And in the beginning of the crisis, a lot of artists and other organizations started using the existing tools, either, releasing their archive recordings or, sort of implementing their digital practice very quickly. We just said, okay, we have this tool. So in case of several scenarios, we will use digital, which we were already investing in. So I think the beginning, it was more that appetite of continuing whatever happens. But then that also had additional issues. As an organization, could you continue? Because you have to keep your existing team intact. You don't know how long the crisis will last, so you need to make sure that, there is some support mechanisms to keep your organization as it is. So we went through all the processes of first looking inwards and then looking outwards. And obviously, when we say it's a responsibility, I'm not saying that, we are the ones who grace the festival to the audience or the artists. No, I mean, but there has to be a collective, let's clean our garden and then it will be a better place kind of an approach. So we did what we could do, which we had, in our hands. And of course it was a process, but I can say that this initial motive drive us through what we wanted to do. And we knew from the beginning that we would have this festival in some shape or form. We were lucky that we were able to keep our sponsor EFG supporting the festival going forward. And we were able to repurpose that support in terms of finance, subsidizing the festival. We had the Arts Council emergency funding, which is also a blessing, especially in this difficult year. That definitely contributed to keeping, the company to a level that we can continue. And then we made sure that the artists, especially the artists that we wanted to present, we keep the commitment. So there wasn't actually. So when we started in March, about 90% of the program was already confirmed as a live event. So whichever artist we can agree to do a potential digital performance, we talk to the existing festival programming first. So whoever you saw in the festival this year, we're already going to have a performance, and we managed to keep the financial commitment similar to that arrangement as well, which again was a part of the responsibility, because I know that in the beginning, obviously the institutions maybe who weren't as lucky as us or had a different approach, they saw digital as a promotion opportunity, but we knew that wasn't going to be fair. So we managed, again, as I say, first of all, we were I mean, I don't want to say that we are naively optimistic, but we actually forced ourselves to be optimistic, and we didn't dwell on the challenges a lot. And we said, okay, what kind of tools do we have? What kind of money do we have? We have this limited pot. Let's repurpose this. We have this tool. Let's learn. And that's the changing bit, isn't it? We started off with serious live sessions, which were really very cozy and amateur, because it was direct from the living rooms or the bedrooms of the artists. And then with the learnings from that, we said, okay, if we're going to do a festival in the name of the same, EFG London Jazz Festival, the quality should be, refined. It has to involve partnerships. And like we had this conversation amongst us yesterday, we were lucky not to be sort of to be caught in the headline, like we were lucky that the festival wasn't in July, for instance, because most of the July festivals or even spring festivals had to sort of cancel. But we had time to think about it properly and to implement it. So that time was a bit wasted in the meantime, because there were a lot of mixed messaging about how the lockdown is going to end. But we knew deep down inside there was going to be potential second wave. Anyone who has kids going to schools would imagine that there would be a second wave in autumn, even with the seasonal flu. So we actually had 3 different plans in place to push the button, whichever is possible to go ahead. And yeah, we went with the worst case scenario, which ended up being I hope a success.
That's very interesting, because I mean, you're talking about a kind of a community a responsibility. That the festival has a history, and despite the massive changes in 2020, there's a responsibility to the community of both artists and audiences to maintain a kind of a stronghold of this brand continuing. And I suppose you were lucky, like some festivals, to have a sponsor that was willing to continue this year. And of course, the emergency funding helps. Some of these things, though, we know maybe are not repeatable. Like they might be one-shot deals in terms of the emergency grants, etc. So we could talk about that a little bit later. One thing I know about the London Jazz Festival is that it's usually over up to a period of up to a month, and it's across many venues. How much of the sort of analog model, I mean, when you were planning for the 3 scenarios, I suppose one being, the most optimistic of hopes that things could be relatively normal, and then the second one, I suppose, being a hybrid model, and then the third one being an entirely online experience. How much of the kind of analog real world did you want to translate into the digital space? And did you find any freedom there with saying, okay, we're going to do this? Or did you find that you had obligations to artists, across a wide area and venues, etc., that you would have had from previous years?
I think, again, this festival was a result of a big synergy, be it from the funders or from the venues, and of course the artists and the audience eventually, which came into place. So we like carrying forward our commitments to the existing programmed artists, we want to carry the commitments to the programmed venues as well. But for some venues, to be used just as a filming space didn't really cover up their costs, because they wanted the buzz, the bar income, the other stuff, which we don't necessarily think about when we operate as a cultural institution, but they are the venues which nourish with those incomes. So some of them, they were going to be in the hybrid model where they can, afford to open their doors, whereas they couldn't unless we, invested a lot of funding into opening the doors of certain venues. So some of the venues, some of the clubs which program during the festival, and then we bring together a collegiate way of working, they were able to do it. Like 606 was able to do it. Ronnie Scott's did a wonderful show with Bill Lawrence. So some of the venues were able to do the digital side of programming. Some venues like King's Place and Barbican, where we had this partnership model where everybody brought their own, corner of their funding into the pot, and we were able to bring in the artistic content and the programming into it, and they were happy not having the audience inside and just being used as a filming venue, so that we could actually give the experience of the audience jumping from one London venue to the other and being able to see different backdrops rather than seeing shows presented in a studio kind of a setup. And also it's a cultural map, and we just want to have that in place. So yeah, I mean, some of the analog programming, in your terms, was able to be carried forward, but the ones who said they couldn't do it was a very friendly, thing, or whatever. Whenever they put their shows, like Jazz Cafe, for instance, there was a wonderful programming at Jazz Cafe, which we actually thought about together. And they couldn't do it because they needed even if it's limited capacity, they needed the audience. And we said, okay, whenever you have these artists, we will give the promotion support to put it behind, because all of these artists are wonderful, musicians who you will actually be programming in the festival. So yeah, they will hopefully continue when things, things are relaxed a little bit.
Yeah, we should talk a little bit later about the something we also spoke about yesterday, which is the value proposition, and the difficult decisions about ticketing versus non-ticketing, and how that equates to value. And as you mentioned, it's not economically viable for certain spaces to open up if they don't have that associated revenue, which keeps the industry going, all facets of the industry. So thanks for that, Pelin. Jason, if I'll come to you, welcome. You're of course no stranger to European shores, but since March you've been grounded, like most other musicians, on the other side of the pond, as we say. So can you talk about what's changed for you during this pandemic, and any other observations from your home base in New York?
Well, here in New York, it's a bit bleak. Because it's a city I moved to because of the music scene that happened from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And none of that exists anymore. So you're in a city that to a degree is vacant for its nightlife, which it's world renowned for. But I think what also it helped me focus on was the kind of thinking that I may have been missing as an artist myself, that allowed me the time to dive into a kind of thinking that I needed to refresh myself of. And also when we reemerge with this thinking in mind. I mean, today is the 4th day of Kwanzaa, and the principle today is Ujamaa, right, which means cooperative economics, which is what we're talking about right now, is the way that a community uplifts by locking arms rather than throwing up borders between them. But the other thing that was an issue for artists before the pandemic and for many years, and probably even if you go back to kind of how jazz emerges and the predators within the industry. I was listening to an interview with the novelist Octavia Butler. And in this interview with the director, Julie Dash, she says, I looked at the kind of future we're building. We're less and less willing to pay for the things that make civilization possible. And yet we imagine that somehow civilization will continue. I don't see that it must. Now, there's a part of that I thought was like right on the money, as far as a culture maker, meaning my friends and the artists, the musicians, the choreographers, the playwrights, the directors, we were in the business of making art. All the musicians that are now in the city who don't have a place to play, and so to a degree we have a way to try to figure this out, but it's not without this notion that the culture becomes free, without any economy around it. We have to be very careful about that. So what I've been watching artists do, which I've been very proud to see these artists figure out, a musician like Orrin Evans in Philadelphia, that he made his home into a club by calling it Club Patio and hosting these sessions throughout the summer and into the fall. Every Sunday from his patio, bringing bands down, playing on the lawn, watching saxophonist Soweto Kinch make a festival about Black peril, and the conversation around what was making artists in the Black Lives Matter movement something that was intrinsically or maybe specifically denied a voice in festivals around the world, right? We talk about the music, but we don't talk about the people. And I think some of these conversations, and this is also going into the conservatory environment too. So I'm teaching at Conservatory, New England Conservatory in Boston. I'm working at the Kennedy Center down in DC and trying to figure out ways to still get artists' voices out to the public. And a lot of us have had to try to figure out a way to do this without feeling like we were selling our souls. Because a lot of people approach the artists with, give me all your ideas, but I'm not going to give you anything in return. And that's not necessarily new because of the pandemic. So artists had to become very focused on each other and also try to find solutions that maybe didn't deal with the industry at whole, but really dealt with the local community that maybe we were kind of ignoring. And that has been, I think, a fruitful thing to come out of a very difficult moment in our history. I mean, also focus on James Reese Europe and the Harlem Hellfighters from 100 years ago. And there's this great parade that happens up Fifth Avenue in 1919 when they returned back to New York. This great parade, but that was right after the Spanish flu. So you have millions of people on the street. So part of me still has this moment, because I've seen this footage of millions of people gathering in New York City along Fifth Avenue, that there's still this time when, even though that was 100 years ago, but the pandemic of the Spanish flu was awful. And so knowing that the music has a role to play in gathering people post-pandemic is also something for us to really look forward to. So I like when Pelin says that we remain optimistic, because the art is about that, though it might represent, sometimes what is most dire in our situations, but the art represents the promise.
I'm muted. That's so interesting, because again, we have this kind of theme of the community coming together, and we kind of have the distinction, I suppose, between the very amorphous term industry and the much more holistic word community, and which one is much more localized, and it's about looking around and seeing, how can we, as you said, Jason, lock arms in terms of, reinforcing this idea, because ultimately it's through the innovation of the people that create art and present it that we can get these outputs to audiences, right? But the other thing that we need to talk about that I suppose is that this industry cannot run on passion alone. So we must come back to the issue of the value proposition and how we kind of equate that. And I suppose I'll ask everybody, once we get through this section, I just want to put it to everybody, is there an opportunity or a collective opportunity to kind of like restart that that equation, as it were, as we come out of this pandemic, and use all of the tools that we've learned in 2020 to prepare us better for a world where the interconnectedness of the digital and analog is inevitable. I think the COVID pandemic has just accelerated something which may have been kind of bubbling away there, all the time. Nadin, if I can come to you, because, like Pelin and also like Atcha, which we'll hear from shortly, you had to make difficult choices as director of Jazzfest Berlin, could you talk a little bit about your experiences there, and maybe things that worked and outcomes which you hadn't maybe expected? I think again we can talk about community here.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that we one of the biggest questions that we asked ourselves while planning the festival, that also, like the London Jazz Festival, only took place in November, so we had eight months of time to learn how to deal with the virus, what the virus would mean for our sector, for our private lives, but also for our professional lives. I think that that's crucial for this year, how much time you had to adapt and rethink and reinvent your festivals, and also to learn from others how they dealt with this. And one of the biggest challenges for us as the Berlin Jazz Festival, that has a big history of 57 years already, and also a big international dimension, of course, also as London and lots of other festivals, was how to keep this international dimension alive, even during the crisis, which still is at first place a crisis of bringing people together, and also a crisis of mobility. And this hits our sector and our cultural world very, very badly. And as Pelin already mentioned, I can only agree to this very strongly, is a big sense of commitment and also a big will of not giving up as a very privileged platform that these established and also highly subsidized festivals are. And then the question was, during the 8 months since March, since the virus hit Europe and Germany, how to deliver a meaningful, how to kind of serve as a meaningful platform for artists to present their art, and also to keep the machine rolling, meaning that lots of other colleagues are involved to make such a big event happen. These are all mainly freelancing colleagues, technicians, engineers, the whole circus that is involved in making these big festivals happen in the end. Sorry, I have something in my throat. So, sorry. I sound a bit like you, Ken.
Yeah, okay. Well,
Yes.
that's me 24/7, Nadine. So,
what we did in the end,
there's no cure.
Yes, it's a cure. In June, I remember this very well. In June, we got in touch with the Roulette, with the colleagues, the wonderful colleagues from the Roulette in Brooklyn, fantastic venue that already has a camera system of 6 robot cameras installed. And we asked them if they would be ready to team up with us, the Jazzfest Berlin, in order to keep 6 brilliant bands that we already got in touch with in January, most of them, if they would serve as a co-producer and co-host of our Jazzfest Berlin New York, as we entitled it by then, meaning that in total we had 6 tandems composed by a band coming from New York, being presented at the Roulette in Brooklyn, and then a band being presented at the Silent Green, a fantastic venue in Berlin-Wedding. And they agreed because music-wise we understood each other very well. They liked the artists. Lots of them had their first European tour planned in their career. We all know how important that is. And as Pelin also said, we had lots of commitments already made by March, of course, and that was kind of a shock. But then what I can recommend and what I really learned is, in times of extreme isolation during lockdowns, and even now we are also in Germany, it's the 2nd lockdown, so we are again isolated, all of us in our living rooms, basically. It is even more important to keep communicating with each other, with the community, as Jason said, with the musicians, with partners on the national and also international level, to kind of not to lose this big sense, this big idea of an international community that we all build up for many, many decennia right now. And we put ourselves a deadline with all of the artists and the Roulette in Brooklyn, and saying that we need to take a decision by September. And it was only by mid-September that it was clear that a European tour would not be possible anymore, because of all of these red zones that popped up within Europe, as we all can probably remember. And by then, all of the American artists and also the European artists canceled their tours for November. And then we knew that our plan B scenario, like having a hybrid festival, hopefully including audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, would take place. And in the end, it didn't take place with any audience, neither in Berlin nor in New York. The same we did with old partners that we have, like very precious partners. The Jazzfest has a long-standing radio cooperation with the National Public Radio in Germany, and together with these colleagues, we also teamed up quite early, already in April, and we formed a working group thinking together in order to find creative ways out of this crisis. And then somebody mentioned, Julia Neupert mentioned, why don't we use our radio studios for concert venues? And as I said, as we all know, this pandemic is a crisis of mobility. the idea was very quickly born to present regional artists across Germany in 8 radio studios in total. And then in Berlin, we teamed up. We had 3 different venues. In total, we produced 40 shows, 40 concerts during our 4 days festival that took place from the 2nd to 5th of November, teaming up with the Roulette in Brooklyn with 8 national radio studios across Germany, 3 venues in Berlin, and 9 video productions. Jason also delivered 1 video statement to our festival. We were asking the King Collective in Berlin and also 3 fantastic US American musicians for video statements already during the first lockdown in April, May, because we also wanted to document this crazy year of a crisis. So in the end, we turned out into a total television production of 25 hours of ongoing live stream.
Which is fantastic, ultimately, Nadine. But something that I think is very interesting there is well, a couple of things. The first one is the fact that these things take time to change. You know, you cannot entirely remold or reconstruct your festival overnight. You need to be working with at least 2 or 3 scenarios, as Pelin mentioned. And I suppose the benefit of having those scenarios in play meant that what was going to be a hybrid model was essentially switched out, in a very short space of time due to the new lockdowns and the red zones that you mentioned. And using radio stations as a concert venue is very interesting as well. I think we need to be creative in the spaces that we use and maybe reevaluate what a space is when it comes to presenting music, because the traditions don't have to apply in the digital mold. The other thing that I find really interesting about changes is that you could incorporate other cities, both in Germany, but also the Roulette in New York. So, the online kind of model allowed you to kind of be more elastic with geography. And I think Roz Rigby in chat mentioned as well, Pelin, that the London Jazz Festival included some venues which were quite a long way from London. And I think I think when you're considering presenting something in an online space, or if you're presenting to an audience a collection of different locations, you don't have to be hyper local in your geography, I suppose. So that's very beneficial. So it's important to have multiple scenarios in play. I'd like to come to Atcha now. And Atcha, you work in a not-for-profit organization, and you also made the decision this year in terms of your developing artist role to showcase artists online. So move your showcase festival entirely online. And I'd like you to talk briefly about what that was like for you guys, but also what it was like for the artists who maybe mightn't have been performing as frequently due to the ongoing pandemic, and then to turn around and do a showcase. Were there challenges associated with that?
All right. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, I would like to say a few words about the Yellow Submarine, because we cannot understand the decision-taking process without understanding what is this place. This is a music center. It's a music production house. It's a music club. It's a recording studio. It's a rehearsal rooms. We have a lot of productions. We have a lot of educational stuff that we are doing. And in March, when it all started, there was a big confusion and a lot of fear, actually. And for me, as a manager, I had to take very fast and important decisions, because we have a building to maintain. We have around 30 employees that we have to understand what and how we are going to work with it. So I think that our big lack is that we have all this educational stuff. For example, we have this matriculation program. It's a 3 years program for high school students that are coming. We have 72 students that are learning music there and have final exams like any other high school. And we had to continue working this project because schools didn't close up, So we need to figure out very fast how to do it without coming to the Yellow Submarine, because we were at the first 3 weeks closed under the government order. So because I'm a tech freak, I took it upon myself to study and to learn all these ways to maintain this connection digitally. And of course, obviously, we started with the Zoom. And after around 3 weeks, we actually came back to the Yellow Submarine because the stores, the street stores were open again. So we decided to come back and start by ourselves the rehearsals and the recordings, no shows, of course. And but very fast we decided that we have to go into these streaming shows because we have a venue and we just had to figure out how to do it. And again, I took 3 weeks and I actually by myself studied the whole way of streaming, shooting video, and I really got into it. And these days I even learned it in a school to be a video photographer, which is really, I love it. But anyway, around May, we already started to do live shows from the Yellow Submarine. And we did it in a different way, which means we did it in like a radio show. Our artistic director, David, was the interviewer, and we did shows 60 minutes long, which the artists are coming and telling about their experience in this pandemic, and they're playing their songs. And it was mostly acoustic and in a different atmosphere. And it was very good. And actually, in one way or another, we do it until today. We try to do 2 shows a week. And this is one thing that led us to the decision of what we're going to do with this showcase festival. Now, when we started working on the festival, it was before the pandemic, even because the festival is usually on November, and the minute it ends, we start thinking about the next one. And we start to develop a new one. And me and Adas, the artistic director of the festival, were traveling to a few showcases in the world. And then the pandemic came, and we just were a bit shocked, I must admit. And we thought that, of course, until November, it will gone, and we can do the same that we did years ago. And so we decided to postpone the decision. We always talked about let's set a date that this will be the dead end of the decision taking about what we're going to do in the festival. Now, when we understood that that the pandemic is here to stay in November, we decided to do it digitally. But we looked for the ways to do it. Of course, more interesting, but more appealing and more satisfying, and also creative and good for the musician themselves and for our guests from overseas. And at the beginning, when we were in a bad shape, Europe was out of the pandemic. It was in the summer, and then the initial plan that we had, it was, allow me to be not modest, was genius. We thought about streaming live from the Yellow Submarine and take 3 or 4 clubs in main city, like we thought about London, Paris, and Berlin, and to rent clubs there and to bring people there from all over Europe to see the shows streaming from Israel. And we started actually work on it, and we took even a producer from Paris, and it was like we were very enthusiastic and very, very happy about it. But slowly, I mean, not so slowly, very fast, the pandemic get back to Europe and cities were locked down again, one after another. So we had to go back to the offices and think again what we want to do. And then we came up with this idea of making actually a TV show. And we thought that we cannot do the regular shows, and we need the artists to go out with something that they can use. So right away we understand that we have to produce for the musicians EPK, a digital EPK, video clip, something that they gonna use. So we filmed all the shows before. It was all live shows in the Yellow Submarine in a different places. We shoot one band inside the bar. It was really a big, massive production because it was all live and live to tape, which means we wanted to keep the atmosphere live as much as possible. And then we made a short documentary for 1.5 minutes for each band that they can showcase themselves. So they gave them really a nice package of marketing that they can use it for years. And then we built all the thing around it. We did a 3 days evening show. I think few of you were there, if I'm not mistaken. And we separated between the audience that could see it by Vimeo or YouTube or Facebook, and we created a closed environment for our guests from overseas by Zoom. So it was like a big party, and we built a very big studio in the Yellow Submarine. We had a special room for our guests with the Zoom. We have a really nice studio that there were interviews, live interviews with the musicians and with some guests. And then we played the shows, the pre-recorded shows. And it was actually like a culture show, or like an MTV show, or like a Eurovision, whichever, a lot of these names came up through the process. For us,
can I ask you, Atcha? I mean, how did the artists feel about this type of showcase environment, particularly with international guests? Because I know that a lot of festivals are showcase festivals designed, for this interaction. I mean, how did you find that interaction in the digital space?
It has a lot of advantages because a lot more guests can come and be there. And beside the shows, a day after the shows, we actually made a networking between the artists to the guests, and it worked great because, again, in the Yellow Submarine, we built some tables with all the information, and it was rooms in the Zoom software. And guests from that we wanted to come in, they came in and they just went around the rooms and met the musicians and talked with them. Now, obviously, we cannot plan anything. Musicians does not know what's going to happen, and bookers, and nobody knows what's going to happen. But the connection happened, and it was like we are doing. We're doing. We are connecting, we are presenting ourselves, we giving the musician and ourselves, of course, hope. And we study so much by this process, and it opened our minds so much to the future. And I'm going to tell you right now that we'll never go back. We're going to use these tools even when the reality as we knew it will come back. The shows with audience will be again, but we're going to use this technology. Sure.
That's really interesting. I think a lot of organizations will come to the same conclusion. It would be remiss of me not to mention the carbon footprint or the lack thereof in having a digital showcase, and the huge benefits that gives. I mean, the overheads for some of these things, and the ability to increase the number of bookers attending these events. I think that's a net good. And one thing that I've noticed throughout the year, which I'd like to ask all of you your thoughts on, is I think we've been uncovering the artistic process a lot more, because when we get people in this kind of a studio or a controlled environment, let's say, as opposed to, you know, this transient live space, we want to interview the artist. We want to get more behind the scenes of what the artist, how they approach the creation of their art. And again, this is, I suppose, the industry trying to equate value, you know, on the output, you know. So I think one of the advantages of a digital space, and Jason, I'm going to put this to you first, and everyone feel free to jump in, but one of the advantages of I suppose this kind of new skill set in a digital environment is that, you know, we have an opportunity to keep the value proposition alive for potentially new audiences, digitally native audiences, etc.
I mean, yeah, that possibility is there for artists who want that, but that's not everybody. And I mean, of all generations, you know, some great artists don't have a cell phone, so you got to find them another way. So there's a part of me that, you know, also as time goes by, that we accept as a future that is inevitable. And also a lot of, you know, I teach at a conservatory, so students are coming into the field, right? So, and they're wondering about what their requirements are as artists. And those requirements are very different than from my generation and then from generations before. So the requirements change, and they change in a way that becomes habit. But the dangerous part about it is there's no substitute for how it feels to be in front of music that happens and hits your body, right? So frequencies that hit your body. So I don't ever want to discount that part, but I do want us to consider the kind of statements that are made when an artist decides to document themselves, because it isn't necessarily objective, you know, that they share their personal space with an audience. I mean, not every artist has that ability to do so. I think what we also might need to start considering is ways of helping the artists when they aren't on the camera, when they aren't at the instrument. I mean, this is the stuff that, you know, I think kind of we probably take for granted as bookers. Can I get you here? Can you eat your meal? Can you play your show? Okay, so now can you get out of my face? You know, that's kind of how it feels as a touring artist sometimes. And we know that feeling, you know, like get paid before you finish playing. But I say that because when I think about value, I think about the value of the health of the community. And that's from the local club on to the international festival, from the local musician on to the touring musician. And that community, they all need each other. And so watching festivals like you all have done, figure out ways to touch and grab hold of people that maybe you never had before, that is necessary. And maybe like Atcha said, yeah, you can't go back to some of these old models because they also go out of style, just like the music does, you know. The culture will still have its point that attracts us to it. But some of these ideas, much like segregation and misogyny and racism and homophobia, also need to they need to go. And they also come into this music too. So we have to make environments that make the ecosystem brighter, and much like Pelin said, like a garden that needs cultivating.
Yeah. I suppose once again we're back into this idea of community and community health and community awareness, more awareness. I mean, something you mentioned there, which we touched on yesterday, was, you know, is this kind of reset in this year, this global upset, is it an opportunity to reset what the concept of touring is fundamentally, and maybe slow it down? Something that I know that webinars, EJN webinars have discussed in the past, about this concept of just slowing everything down, have the artist inhabit a space for longer, so any travel that is done, you know, can be incorporated into this kind of much more, you know, for want of a better word, holistic process. As an artist, how do you feel, you know, about that in terms of like, you know, a value proposition going forward?
I mean, it's what we've signed up for as culture bearers. Is you bring your pot to another soul and you pour into each other's pot, and you share cultural ideas. But I think, you know, as touring musicians, it always feels better when you're in a space for a longer amount of time, for a week, you know, rather than one night, you know. And that means you're a part of an environment, and you're part of a culture. You have more meals, you understand more of the language, you hear, more of the custom. And as travelers, that's necessary. I mean, we have a long history of that. But I think sometimes in America, the other problem is America exports this music. The way it cultivates here is really, on the way that America was built. It's built on some hard shit that that it doesn't think is hard, but it's been awful for people for centuries. So it doesn't know how to cultivate it in the way that, and I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I think we all need a lot of help on how to really cultivate this in a much more cohesive way. We've kind of faulted our way to this point where it works, we get funding, people clap at the end. That can't be everything though, right? So I think we also have to shift some of that around too, because we clearly are also deleting or omitting conversations from it that I think are necessary too.
Fantastic. And Pelin, I mean, if I come to you from speaking from a programming perspective, this concept maybe of less one night stands in terms of, this bam, bam, bam of music, because we know that international travel, I mean, it's ridiculous right now to consider, a 10-day tour in 12 days or 14 days. I mean, that sort of rapidity is gone. I mean, can we reinvent festival models to kind of, incorporate an artist over a longer period of time? Of course, it's been done, but like for the audiences, do you think that's something that we can kind of sell to an audience?
I think during this pandemic, some of the questions that I've been some of the issues that I personally have been questioning a lot, I'm sure most of you also, I just had the chance to give a second thought onto them. I think, especially in the UK, I was a bit surprised coming from Turkey to here, even though there are more, there are incredibly more structures around public funding, which we didn't really have in Turkey. I mean, we had some, but it wasn't meaningful. It was still based on box office. So the programming had certain freedom, but didn't really. So even there was some money towards sponsorship, funding, whatever you call the additional income stuff. The production is so expensive, lots of stuff around it. It was purely based on box office. I do understand box office is important in terms of financially making the festival sustainable, but also has a symbolic value where the artist's work is also rewarded through, from audience using the box office as a tool. But that was really tying our hands. So all the decisions were made based on, is this going to be a success in terms of box office or not? Therefore, it kind of started shaping the decision making around artistic stuff. Can we do more residencies? Can we actually tour this band or artist once they're in London? Could we actually take them to other cities? Again, a contribution to the, to being more sustainable, environmentally friendly, rather than asking the artist, do the show and leave to another European city. Can we actually invest more? But it was all, defined by box office. So I don't have an answer to this. And I understand the symbolic value there as well as the financial value. But I think we need to address that that's the reality. And having this interesting experience where even if it was limited, there was some sort of a freedom of not necessarily caring about the box office this year.
Yeah.
Yes, we had some shows which were ticketed. Yes, we also didn't want to give the messaging of the artist's work should be available for free. That was an agreement we made with the artist. Can we make this show for free? Or even if the numbers wouldn't necessarily be as massive as the free shows, can we make this ticketed? But we still had the freedom of not caring about the box office, but then to reach out to different communities than our actual jazz festival community or whoever. It was a global audience. We had more than 1.5 million people actually watching the shows, millions of impressions, engagements. So we learned other tools. So that gave us the freedom. So how can we find the midway between keeping that financial reality in our lives when we go back. And it's not just about financial, of course, live experience will never be, I personally believe it will not be replaced by this Band-Aid situation. Of course, we all were creative and we were excited about our new learnings, and we will carry these new learnings to the future, like Atcha says, and we will never ever park them. We will keep on using them. But I don't personally believe that it will replace, obviously, the live experience. And how can we find a good midway between? And how can we make use of our, resources better so that reality doesn't really confine us in terms of programming decisions? And also, even if we had, enormous, limitless funding, how can we make festivals more, artistic? It's not a sort of a show off of thousands of names back to back, what is your headliner? This is a concept we've been around for, like Nadin says, 50 plus years, 30 years. Now, whatever we as the festival bring to you will have, we are the channels, the platforms for the artists to come and perform together with you, for you. So please take our word. We don't need to be doing this lineup extravaganza. Can we come to that point? Digital Festival made us do that. So a tiny act from, somewhere in Europe or from Africa here and there was possible to reach out to thousands of people. Probably we wouldn't be able to get 40, 50 people in a club for them. So these positives, how can we still learn and steal from these in a physical world? I think we will definitely continue the digital learnings, especially for the artists that we want our audiences to discover, share our passion about the music. I think digital will definitely help.
Yeah, I think we're just, essentially we're adding strings to our bow, really. I think the one, I suppose, I don't want to call it a good thing that's come out of the pandemic is that we've all upskilled in how we interact with technology. Even people who were, less interested in that, they realized that something that was an adjunct to the real world became the central thing by which we got our fix. And I think that it's only through sharing our experiences that we can understand, what works and what doesn't work. We've all upskilled ourselves. And Atcha mentioned about, just being into technology. So he just took it upon himself to try, multi-camera rigs and stuff like that. And I know personally from my own experience, I just learned so much about Final Cut Pro that I never knew in my life and didn't want to know. But suddenly I go, okay, it clicked into a workflow which became meaningful. And this is something that we've learned. I think, Pelin, you've pretty much answered already a question. And we're at the hour mark, but to be quite honest with you folks, we're never ever going to get anywhere close to in depth in that short amount. So we'll go another 10. But a question from Steve Mead here, which I think, Pelin, you've answered. Preserving our values through change has been especially critical for us all this year. Did any of you panelists discover any new values in 2020 that you maybe were not expecting to emerge? Nadin,
Can I?
yes.
Yes, absolutely. And it's what I already tried to mention in my first statement. It's this deep sense of community that needs to be kept alive. It's exchanging and learning from each other. I remember very well that we as Europe Jazz Network installed very quickly in April after the first shock, that came along by being hit by this pandemic. We installed in April already a think tank. Now it's called the EJN Café, and it's just an open platform where colleagues from all over the world can come together and exchange ideas. This is super important to share the experience. Like, how does it work in Norway? How in Cairo? What's this political situation in France, in the States, wherever? That's very important. Secondly, I went for very long marches. Like, we couldn't meet in closed rooms during first lockdown. So I went for long walks with musicians, lots of musicians. I have been talking to them in a very different way from human being to human being, first of all, and not from organizer to artist, that I would like just facilitate a gig, you know, because everything has been put into question. And by teaming up with partners, by teaming up with long-standing partners or new partners that you need to find, and also by communicating 100 times more than in a usual festival year, you learn and you can get as a human being and also as a professional through this crisis. It's only possible together. This is what I learned. And it's even more important, as I said, in times of isolation, to kind of keep going, communicating on all levels possible, what we are doing now. And I mean, this is what I learned, and it is possible, even though that traveling is not possible. So the way we are used to communicate and to meet each other it's over, it's gone. My last trip was to New York to Winter Jazz Festival, and since then everything has been basically cancelled. And if we would not be creative enough and find other ways of how to communicate and find innovative ways out of this crisis by using the possibilities of this new technology, by using creative brains all together and not becoming too desperate, although this crisis hits our sector very, very badly, as we know, it's even more important to stick together, to come together, to kind of really exchange ideas to bring us all out of this crisis, and also to kind of go a step further. I think that there is no really way back to the year 2019, where everything has been nice, and you know, we passed the point of no return already. I mean, the society will change, and we don't know how long this pandemic will keep us busy. I'm sure our culture sector will be busy with this pandemic now, with the vaccines, until the end of next year at least. And then again, the question is, how can we make festivals and clubs and touring greener, more sustainable? How really to bring local musicians together with international musicians? It has only been my third edition of the Jazzfest Berlin as artistic director, but I have no headliners. We had never had real headliners, you know, since we are doing it. We are much more thinking in community and the sense of community, and make things possible together, and to step out of the daily routine and to facilitate freedom, you know, free space, and also to take risks, and also to take risks to fail, you know. Otherwise, I mean,
failure is always an option. I mean, especially in the improvised music world, failure is indeed probably a good result sometimes, you know. So, but that's really interesting what you're saying. You know, you're talking about more communication. You're talking about more community, and I think that those two things are actually critical, you know, to how we develop this, because, you know, here's the thing, folks, we have to do this all over again in 2021, you know, and I suppose earlier we mentioned, you know, the fact that I think there's quite a lot of solidarity for artists, and a lot of goodwill, and in some areas some good government funding, etc. In other areas, you know, not so good. And I suppose if one thing this pandemic has done is it's probably dissolved any concept of us and them into it's just us, you know. And I suppose that's where, Nadin, where you're mentioning about the you know, talking with musicians kind of on a, you know, everything is the setup for the dialogue has completely changed. You know what I mean? There's a different starting point to hello, you know, now than there was ever before in the past. And how are you is a completely different thing. I think we've become a little bit more attuned to what others are doing. I want to talk about audiences for a minute, because I know from the perspective, you know, of an artist, I mean, that binary between an artist and an audience in the live space will never be nothing will ever replace that. But a lot of things have had to change this year. I mean, Jason, from your perspective, particularly from the USA, you know, because traditionally you would do a lot of work, you know, worldwide, but in Europe as well. What have you been noticing, about how artists feel, A, with lack of performance opportunities, obviously, but B, with how they're getting to the fact that audiences may not be there and limited audience, etc. What's it doing to artists?
Well, I mean, it hurts, but I'm in a place where I can imagine what an audience still sounds like after I finish playing. Like, oh yeah, I hear them, even though they're not there. So I have a yearly gig at the Village Vanguard that's, kind of become a New York tradition. And this was the first time, of course, we played in the Vanguard with no audience, which felt great also to kind of play for the spirits that are in the room, but also have that streamed out to the world for people who had always heard about this gig but never saw it, right? And so that was great, right? The Village Vanguard now becomes the portal, where you can still hear bands play. Weekly, they've been doing these shows. The other gig we did back in September was right when New York was trying to reopen. The club in Brooklyn, in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, called Sister's Place. It's been around for maybe 30, 25 years. And so they're like, come play. We're going to invite like a few people in here. And so the band played again for a few people. And it felt great to play in the neighborhood for the people who preserve the music, But the other part I think artists are feeling is any interaction feels good, whether it's through Instagram, whether it's through TikTok, just some kind of like back and forth, whether it's through this or whether it's through watching so many friends play on Facebook Live and just listen to them for 20 minutes. Smalls has been doing a tremendous job. But also with that, what I also noticed from my community is also the hard parts, the amount of depression in our community is heavy. The amount of musicians who have not been necessarily open about what they've been battling as musicians, and their mental state has become a part of the thing that I think we as the community also have to be very aware of, how to help musicians through this time too. So there's a lot of reaching out because people really do need help. And I've thought of, and what we've learned from the music over this century is that the music and the musicians use the stage not as a place for therapy, but a place of communing, to ask a lot of questions really fast in rapid time that then you take with you as you leave the space to generate, like, how can I move through the world? I've watched Miles Davis move through the world, and then I've watched him get beaten, and put into a police car at the end of that, right? So that still happens today, and that affects musicians too. And I think musicians are asking that people in the community be very aware of the trauma it takes to make the art, because it is not easy to get on planes and go through these kinds of transgressions on a every night, in every venue, in every hotel, in every airplane, in every drive from the hotel to the venue, that we have to guard ourselves from the kind of trauma that exists for especially Black people traveling the globe. It is not easy that we show up there. So I think what I'm seeing is my community really needs help from people from us in this community to really understand what it takes to make the music.
That's well said. I mean, I think that we talked briefly about this yesterday in our quick pre-webinar chat about the paradigm shifts in the output or the presentation of this music. We don't want any of that to mask the fact that the creative process has not changed and will not change. So for an artist, the art of the act of creating their art and all of those years spent developing their craft, I mean, it still takes that same amount of time. It still takes that same amount of dedication against, sometimes, in this case, almost insurmountable odds in order to bring that to a stage. And I think traditionally we've all just been used to just looking at this final output, this final stage element, which I think through this pandemic, we might be able to just sort of pull back the curtain a little bit more, because it's important maybe to equate the this value thing that we've been discussing, which is just so important, because the idea of ticketing and non-ticketing is something that every programmer has grappled with when they're moving into a digital space, which is saturated with content. As we said at the start of this pandemic, we never thought we'd be competing with fluffy cat memes for digital airtime. But that is the general digital space which we sort of had to turn to, and the expectation from a lot of audience, or let's say call them consumers in this instance, is that what they see is going to be free. It's going to be fast, free, and it's not going to be this in-depth experience. So what do we think? And the question for all the panel: what do we think about audiences? I mean, how do they feel about these online experiences versus the real experience? Maybe Atcha or Pelin or Nadin, from the perspective, you've gotten some feedback, I'm sure, from people who've attended your online activities. Anything surprising there? Atcha, you go first, and then Pelin.
Okay. First of all, as we know that there are not so many people as an audience in our day-to-day, in our ongoing lives. We know that we're dealing with a form of art, and I think any art that is not appealing to most of the people. So to begin with, we have a small audience. And I think this audience, as I see it, appreciate what we are doing, because they are with us in the same world, in the same feeling. So they are just looking for it, and we have great response from the audience, from our audience, from the artist audience, because there is another thing that is going on, and I'm sure you've noticed it in your countries as well, that when the musicians, the artists, actually, the actors, the dancers, everybody stayed without a work and asked for help from the government, they got a lot of responses from the people like, get a job, get a real job. You probably heard it a lot. Get a real job, what do you do? What is to be an artist, But our day-to-day art audience that used to appreciate art and still appreciate art are with us, with the artists, and they are willing to be part of it, to take part. Part of them are willing to pay for this, for consuming the shows. We have the responsibility and the job to find the real economic model, how it works, because selling tickets in this economic model is not working so much. It's working for the big artists, it's working in the pop life, in the rock, the heavy stuff. It's not working for the indie, for the jazz, for the world music. And we have the responsibility to find the ways to provide it to the musicians. And this is actually what we do in the Yellow Submarine. So I found a way, and I found the economic way to pay for the shows without, and raise funds from the government, from the municipality, and really pay for their artists for playing. And without taking money from the audience, which needs to be changed as well, but we're figuring it out. So in answer to your question, I feel a lot of great responses from the audience. I see that there are a lot of great initiatives in other organizations here in the world, not only music, I see galleries that are doing great things. I see literature stuff. I see, of course, dancing and theater. They are all trying to be there, and the audience that used to go are still coming, and this is our job, to maintain and keep them.
Thanks, Atcha. Very well said. Pelin, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think what we've been doing has been always defined by other bigger forces in the scene who had been like, if there was a corner to be, you know, sort of occupied, it was already occupied by either mainstream or big corporations or the music industry's top heads. Like at the moment, you mentioned cat videos. The digital platforms are taking advantage of the voluntary content input of individuals, and I'm not, you know, artists and us who are helping out the artists to find a voice within that, you know, mess. I think it's such a difficult struggle. So again, a balance of holding on to our existing community and making sure that their habits kind of change and adapt, that they actually continue supporting the artists and the festivals in a manner of, you know, similar thing, buying a ticket, going inside the venue. If it's not possible, can you actually repeat that pattern if things need to continue digitally? So we had experienced that in our digital format, where if we were doing these individual shows as a pop-up content provision throughout the year, I don't know if we would be equally successful. But there was a sense of supporting the overall festival phenomenon. They wanted to be there. They wanted to say that I go to London Jazz Festival, or I cannot go actually to London Jazz Festival, but now I can, was a statement of its own. And of course, supporting, not necessarily buying tickets. Of course, as I said, there were models that we had sold tickets for, but being there, watching, sharing their screen while they were, you know, sharing it on the social media, etc. But again, it's a question of, is this because this was the first year of the crisis and, you know, we actually had this new, you know, habits, or is it going to be sustainable if we do it half and half, you know, live, but then still provide the interaction with the global community or non-London, you know, viewers and clubs and artists who want to participate? So we have to find ways of bringing that community feel into you know, whatever model we choose to.
Yeah,
continue.
well, I think we can look at different fiscal models. I think that we have to kind of like, you know, you mentioned there about, you know, sharing the content. You know, the active participant audience member is very valuable, you know, in this whole equation to kind of perpetuating the art, and it could also be that they would be interested to buy merchandise and all of these things. So there's different ways of equating revenue to the model, and of course there's the patronage model, which can be reflected back in the local arts cultural communities and the funds that are in there. I think that we could look at that as well. But what's clear is that you know, it's what we do that has defined us, and it's what we will do that will define us in 2021. So we write the script, and I think that we will, to be positive on this whole thing, I mean, obviously, we will continue to innovate. Now, sadly, and I knew this going in, but it's sad to be here. I knew we would never get anywhere near all the things that we wanted to say done in this short amount of time, but we do have to wrap it there. Yeah, so as we draw this webinar and indeed this series to a close for 2020, I'd like to thank our fantastic guests on this episode, Pelin, Nadin, Jason, and Atcha. Thank you all so much. Be sure to check out the other webinars in this series for more insights and tips for this global community. And on behalf of the EJN board and EJN staff, and indeed to everybody watching, I wish you all a very happy and hopeful 2021, driven by our collective innovation, our adaptability, and most importantly, our improvisatory spirit. So stay safe, everyone, and thanks for watching.